So I'm going to create this indicator data, and I'm going to establish the source of the data, and I'm going to establish some properties, props. All right? Then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create, and we haven't gotten to that yet, but I'm going to create this thing called a range. When I create the range establishes numeric intervals. That's a good way to say it. All right, it establishes numeric intervals and properties. So let me give you an example. I might create an interval of 1 to 10, and I'll give it the property below target. I'll give it a label, below target, and I'll give it a color of red. All right, that's an example. So that if the data that I'm reading, if the value is between 1 and 10, in certain gauges or bar charts, it'll show up with a label of below target, and it'll show up in red. So these ranges interact with the data. If the data falls within a range, then it displays those particular properties. Okay? And then there's also something called display types. And there are a lot of different display types. The categories, the general categories of display types can be tabular, or tables. They can be graphs, bar charts and such, and they can also be something called a gauge. I always forget how to spell gauge. A or A-U?
A.
Gauge. All right? All right, so these are the components, and what the indicator does, the reason I went through all this before I talked about an indicator, is when I create an indicator, what I do is I specify what's the data, what's the range that I'm going to be using. Remember, those two interact with each other. I specify what's the display type I want to use, graphs or tables or gauges. And then I, of course, have my own properties that I'll establish for the indicator. So basically, these are created, and then the indicator picks which ones to put together to all these, depending on which ones I pick, that's what the indicator is going to display. It could display a gauge, like a speedometer or a tachometer. It could display a bar chart. It could display a tabular report with little icons in it. So there's a lot of different things that the indicator, it could all be the same data and the same range, but the display type will determine what it looks like. Or some display types don't even use range. All right? So the indicator determines what you're going to see. Okay? And so the indicator data gets, usually you do this first. You establish what your data is going to be. And so we show that when I create the data, I can give the data certain properties. I can give the data hyperlinks. I can give it labels. Okay, so that's stuff that I can establish when I create the data. So that's what we were talking about when I said properties there. The range, remember I said it's an interval, so here we say, of course, more than one interval for the same range. So this shows for this range, anything below 600,000 is going to have a label of way below target, and it's going to be dark red. Right? And then if it's between 600 and a million, or between a million and 4,000, 4,500,000, and so on, all the way up to greater than 9 million. So these are the properties that are established for those intervals. So I don't establish just one interval. I establish multiple intervals and targets for each of them. So when the data falls within one of these intervals, it'll get these properties depending on which display type I use. So it might change the color of a bar, or it may change the color of a gauge. Like we showed the gauge, this is a gauge up here, it's called a slider. So the gauge colors change based on where the data value falls. This data value fell within the yellow. So it fell somewhere between 1 million and 4,500,000. All right? That's how that was. And what are we showing here? So here we show the dashboard. The dashboard can specify which, so let me add that up here. So when you create a dashboard, dashboards are very, very simple. All they do is select one or more indicators. That's it. All right, and then properties. So the indicator is going to feed into the dashboard. All right. The properties would include interactions, so I can establish interactions between the indicators. All right, so the steps to build the dashboard, and this chart worked out pretty good here. Step one is the data. And you don't necessarily have to do it in this order, but kind of makes logical sense. Step two is create a range. Step 3 is to create an indicator. Step 4 is to create a dashboard. And then step 5 says test the dashboard. And the way you do that is you go into something called Information Delivery Portal, IDP. And there is, in there, you can use what's called a dashboard portlet. And that dashboard portlet is used to display one dashboard. All right, so if I want to display multiple dashboards, I have to create multiple portlets. Each portlet can display one dashboard. So that's step 5. Notice that I skipped display types. You don't create these. These are out of the box display types. These come with the dashboard, and you just pick which one you want to use when you're creating the indicator. Okay? That kind of hopefully puts it all together for you. A lot of different pieces, a lot of different moving parts. One of the things to keep in mind is you might create some indicator data, and you might use that data in multiple dashboards. You might create a range, and you might use that range for multiple data sources. So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one correlation. All right, now the indicator data. One thing we tell you here is it can be a lot of different types of data. Okay, it can be an information map. Source data can be information map. I'll put IM. It can be an SQL query. If you know SQL, select star from table. Okay, you can create your own queries. You can actually write your own queries and use that as a source for a dashboard or for an indicator. It can be a stored process, SP, and it can be a registered table. So a table that is registered to the metadata server can also be used as the source. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that every row that this source returns is going to create another bar, if it's a bar chart. Every row that this returns is going to create another row in a table, if it's a tabular display type. If it's a gauge, it will actually create, if I'm using like a tachometer, and I have 100 rows in my data source, I'll get 100 tachometers showing up. Okay, so that indicator data is going to be highly summarized. Wow. All right. So, questions? It comes with information delivery portal. Okay, so it comes with BI and SAS Business Intelligence package. And that Business Intelligence package includes Web Report Studio, Information Delivery Portal, includes some other stuff that we're not covering here, including the Office Analytics product and OLAP. It includes OLAP stuff too. But it comes with the BI.
You cannot use this on several pages like infrastructure design.
No. It's not a standalone. It's not licensed separately. It's part of Business Intelligence. All right. So we talked about the information map here. I kind of gave you an idea of what this was. It's kind of a view. So the information maps do not contain data. The information maps point to data. It might be multiple data sources that are being joined together. It could be one data source that's being summarized. One thing to keep in mind is that an information map is the purpose of an information map is to perform summarization. So the maximum number of rows that is going to be returned by an information map is 10,000 rows. By default, information maps will always summarize within the categories that you establish. All right? The range, when we get into the range, I'll show you all this stuff, but basically I've got labels and colors, I established intervals, and then there's this thing called a code interval. Honestly, this code interval establishes colors for certain types of gauges. Some gauges are called static gauges, and they can only display 3 colors. And the code intervals can only be 3 values: below target, on target, above target. So this establishes red, yellow, and green as the colors for certain gauges. Any gauge is called a static gauge. Would use this property to determine what color it's going to be. The dynamic gauges and other things like bar charts would use any colors that you establish over here. All right. When you create an interval, like I said, I kind of already covered this. When you create an interval, you decide on the data source. You decide if the display type you're using needs a range. You decide which range. You pick the display type. You set the property. Okay, that's what you do when you create an interval. There are a lot of properties. Some of the properties determine height and width. Some properties determine how to group the data. If it's some type of chart, you need to specify, what's on my horizontal axis, what's on my vertical axis. And then there are some personalized user settings you can establish. To add objects to a dashboard, that's one of the simplest things to do. You just go into create new dashboard, and you just say, okay, I want these indicators to be in that dashboard. Really easy. And there are some properties you can establish, and those are the interactions between indicators. Okay, and what we'll also see is you can establish things like aligning up the different indicators. You can specify a layout, and you can specify font settings if you have any text objects. All right, so that's all in the dashboard. All right, dashboard objects, give it display name, position, size, needs percentage, and whether the object should be displayed in the toolbar, bar, or board. All right. And I mentioned the interactions. What this allows me to do is by clicking on one by clicking on one indicator, have it change something in another indicator. So that's what these interactions do. We'll create one. All right, types of interactions, I can highlight data, so if I click on a bar and I have a table, it might highlight the rows in that table that the bar is representing. I can filter data. That's what we're going to do. We're going to click on a bar that's going to be, 2010, and it'll filter the data that's showing up in the month, and so I'll only see months for 2010. So it'll do local filtering. You can also have the filter execute on the server rather than have it execute locally. Typically, you want it to execute locally because, again, we're not going to be dealing with a lot of data here. However, in certain cases, if you're showing averages or things that need to be filtered on the server before the statistics are calculated, you may need to do that on the remote server. But if possible, it's faster and simpler to do it locally. All right? And the interactions, we'll see this. We just, it's pretty easy to say, okay, this indicator is going to have a filter on local system. It's going to filter year, and it's going to filter the year on the target indicator. All right? And that's exactly what we're going to do, and this is what it's going to look like. When I click on year here, it's going to filter the year that's displayed here.
What do you call the local system?
It's going to use the local system.
Which is the desktop?
Yeah, because what happens is this data is actually pulled down to the desktop display. So it'll locally filter that if you can. What I was saying is if you can do it locally, you should do it locally, simply because it's going to be faster. You won't have to go back to the server, filter all the data before it sends it back. This arrow will not show up for the end user. This is for you as a developer. You can visually see that these two are interacting with each other. All right? So in the workshop, what we're going to do is we're going to create all those components. We're going to create two data objects. We're going to create a range. We're going to create two indicators. We're going to create a dashboard. And we're going to enable interaction. So we're going to do all this up here, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and then eventually, well, we don't mention it here, but step 5 will be to then display the dashboard in the portal. So we'll also do step 5 there. All right, why don't we take a break?